All right, everyone. So we are going to get started. We're very excited. We have an incredible panel joining us for our Responsible AI Institute virtual event series. Today, specifically on making sense of the US AI regulatory landscape. Of course, there is a lot happening in US AI regulation at the moment. And we're so excited to have a variety of experts joining us today for this conversation. So, with that said, I will hand things off to our moderator, Andrew, to kick things off.
Awesome. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to have you all here today. Up front, we need to apologize. Some of our panelists, including Jeff, had some last-minute logistical issues and won't be able to make it today. But really looking forward to this conversation with these two amazing experts talking about AI regulation in the US. For some quick logistics, you can go ahead and post any questions you have in the chat. I'll try and answer those and address those throughout. And we'll also have a couple minutes at the end for any additional Q&A as follow-up. Today, we're going to be covering broadly three different sections of this. The first, we'll spend about 15 to 20 minutes talking just broadly on the overview, the latest updates on AI regulation in the US. We'll talk a little bit about what we're hearing from different organizations and how they're preparing for those, and also talk a little bit about our own thoughts on what will be coming up next. What should we expect to see out of different levels of government over the next year or so, and other trends on that front. We'll kick off with some quick introductions and we'll dive into it. So quick introduction for me. My name is Andrew Gumino Chong. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Trustable. We're an AI governance and compliance software company. So I spend far more time digging through all these regulations than I ever thought I would as a software engineer. But I'm happy to be moderating this discussion. I'll pass it over to Hadassah.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. Hadassah Drukarc. I am the Director of Policy and Delivery at the Responsible AI Institute. I have a legal background originally from the Netherlands, so I completely am aligned with you, Andrew. I spend more time looking at these US regulatory frameworks than I thought when I was in the Netherlands. So looking forward to this panel, and I'll pass it off to Jackie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jackie Bossman. I'm currently a counsel on the Committee on House Administration. So basically the committee in the House of Representatives that sort of determines and lays the groundwork for how the House runs. Prior to this position, I was with Senator Mike Rounds from South Dakota, who was involved with the bipartisan AI roadmap in the Senate with Senators Schumer, Heinrich, and Young. So I have a little bit of experience in both chambers working on AI and excited to talk about it today.
Awesome. And with that, we'll kind of dive into it. My first question will be for you, Hadassah. Really just, why don't you give us a high-level overview? What are some different levels of government that are acting on AI? What are some key updates there? And we'll kind of start to dive into some more specifics.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a lot that we're seeing that is going on. Increasingly, we're seeing this complex web of regulations, regulations both at the federal level and at the state level, and it's becoming complex for organizations to really navigate, where do I start? What do I look at? What is all of this about? So just as a point of departure, I think it's important to note that as of yet, there is no federal legislation that focuses on AI. There definitely are several federal legislations and laws that focus on aspects of AI, so they are concerned with AI. But there isn't like an EU AI Act of the United States, essentially. Let's put it that way. What we have seen is that there are a lot of frameworks that guide the development of regulation on AI in the United States. Think of the Biden administration's executive order of roughly, I believe, a year ago now, end of 2023, focusing on federal agencies, focusing on the developers of large foundational models, providing insight in how to mitigate some of these risks at the governance level, and like focusing on this risk mitigation aspect. We've also seen the AI Bill of Rights within the United States, setting out a principles and practice-based approach to how certain risks in AI should be addressed, aligned with a lot of these core principles that we're seeing really all across the United States, Western Europe, Canada, etc. A lot of organizations, large AI companies, also provided voluntary commitments to support these efforts. But again, we're not seeing this big piece of legislation at the federal level yet. Nevertheless, there is a lot going on in terms of legislation. We keep hearing about bills coming around. That's mostly at the state level, where we're looking at different states trying to address some of the consequential decisions posed or created by AI, mainly in those key areas that are governed by civil rights law. And we're also seeing some sector-specific focuses in terms of legislation at the state level. Think of healthcare, think of education, HR, etc. So there are some examples of those as well. I could go on and on about this, but I think I'll leave it at that to see what some more practicalities are.
Yeah, and that's an awesome overview. I figured we could kind of actually take this a little bit top down, going from the federal, then talk about the states, maybe even end on some updates from some of those different fronts. Actually, maybe even starting at the intergovernment level, there's a lot of news in the past few weeks about the US, the UK, and the EU signing a global treaty on AI. There's a lot of things talking about how this is a legally binding treaty. I wonder if you could quickly maybe just touch upon what's inside of that, why it's relevant, what it means by legally binding. And then Jackie, afterwards, I'll turn it over to you to ask what happens next now at Congress with a treaty like that being signed. But Hadassah, we can start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really interesting development. And kind of like the first question that it poses in my mind coming into this as an outsider is, where's the US trying to head with this? I'm just really curious in this, race towards both building and then regulating AI. This is a really interesting move. I think definitely a statement. In terms of the actual contents of this framework convention on AI by the Council of Europe, I don't think the actual contents are all that different from what we've already seen, right? It's not like this piece suddenly sets out really practical guidelines on how to achieve trustworthy, safe, secure AI. It's very much aligned with a set of basic principles around human dignity, autonomy, fairness, non-discrimination, all of those types of aspects. Then it also sets out a number of procedural mechanisms and some risk management components are also included in there. I think what is the most interesting part of this is when it comes down to the scope of application, right? Who does it apply to? Applies to public authorities and private actors. And the idea is that those actors can either be directly obligated to commit to those and comply with those different requirements in that piece, or they can implement certain measures that could give action or could put those different principles and concepts and requirements into action. And the first thing that comes to my mind when I see this is forms basically a foundation for regulation across different jurisdictions, including the United States. I'd be curious to see where it heads, but I think that's the most interesting component out of this framework.
Awesome. And Jackie, over to you. What happens next now that the US has signed a treaty around that? What does Congress need to do in response to kind of implement or respond to that?
Yeah, so I'm not a super expert on foreign relations, but from my understanding, it would go through the Senate approval and it has to be ratified by Congress. And so I think that would be the next step. It's interesting timing with the election coming up, and obviously whatever happens with that in a sort of lame duck session that could be the end of November and December. So very interested to see what ends up happening. But I think it would just follow the typical standard procedure throughout Congress and then maybe get ratified if it actually moves.
Yeah, how does that tie into then some of the other work that you've been involved with, both with Senator Rounds, now on the House side? You give us a quick overview of the types of legislation that you're talking about. Last year there was a lot of Senate Insight forums that you mentioned. Now the House has an AI working group. You kind of give us maybe a quick overview and rundown of stuff on the legislative side at the federal level.
Yeah, so we were pretty lucky with having the EU put out their EU AI Act before we have taken a bite at legislation over here, because I know, at least with my former boss, we were meeting with a lot of the key architects of that piece of legislation quite frequently. They would be flying over to the US and meeting with key stakeholders over here to sort of give us their lessons learned, advice on how to move through this. And that's sort of where some of the inspiration with the AI forums, I believe, came from, is when they were working on it over in the EU, they did an entire educational series beforehand, because it's very important for individual legislators to understand what they may be legislating on before they can ever take a bite at that apple. So that was sort of how we started, and where we wanted to start from is giving anybody who was interested at a legislator level information on the topic, and then pushing everything that we had learned throughout those insight forums out so then committees could go through their standard operating procedure to come up with legislation in each of their individual jurisdictional areas, because that was also something that was very important to us. AI is this big scary thing when we talk about it to most people, but then when you get down to the nitty gritty, it really falls into each individual topic. So healthcare and how the healthcare industry approaches AI is going to be completely different than how the financial services industry approaches AI, as compared to how criminal liability is assigned to AI developers or so on. And so you think of it as this giant thing, but really it comes down into these tiny little pots that everyone sort of has to address individually, which is why when we were doing the insight forums, at least in the AI roadmap, we really looked at pushing it out to committees who could then focus on their specific portion of how AI would affect their industry. And so from what I'm seeing, both on the Senate side and on the House side, I believe the Science Committee over here just pushed out 9 AI bills last week. And so I think that there is actually movement in each individual committee. And I think there's going to be a lot of AI sections in some of the must pass bills that we're going to see, like NDAA. So there is movement. What I'm curious, and I truly don't know the answer on, is if we're going to have some sort of giant AI package like the EU did with the EU AI Act, or if we'll just take small bites at the apple in all the legislation that's going to come out at the end of this year and going into the next few years, if it'll just be small bites rather than a large comprehensive bill. I don't know where that will land.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's a question actually in the chat that's maybe a nice follow-up here. Is there discussion about a singular body to oversee AI, or what's the thinking on whether to set up something similar to the AI office that the EU did, something like an FDA for AI? I know there's been a couple proposals. Any updates or discussions or bills around that?
I would say from my experience with this topic, it's very much still in discussion, and it's sort of two camps competing with each other. Like I just said, we look at it through all these different lenses. And so would an overarching AI office be able to adequately address all of the issues in healthcare, financial services, you name it, education? Or is it better to have AI officers within those portfolio specific agencies who would be able to address it? That it's a tough question to ask and to answer. So I think that's what people are battling with. And from where I'm looking from, I don't think that there's been a solid answer on that. But maybe we'll see. Maybe we'll see something.
I'm
Yeah,
happy to just jump into this also. Oh, so sorry,
Yes,
Andrew. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point that you make. Raising the question: do we even want this? Would we even want like one body to like be responsible for overlooking and overseeing all of this? If you just look across the border, beyond like the expertise, like level of expertise, just from a capacity perspective, you could also wonder whether it's going to be effective to have like one body that oversees everything. Just look at what's happening in the EU, right? The questions around who is going to be responsible for implementation, and the many different perspectives. So I agree with you. It's going to be like a question that we may need to answer at some point, or that will be answered. But I think like, do we want this is the first question that should be answered, and can we actually meet those the standards that requires?
Yeah, maybe interestingly, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, some of the last amendments made to the California Frontier Bill actually moved what was supposed to be its own regulatory agency for AI just to be a division now of an existing stuff to set some standards instead of being a new enforcement agency. So curious to see if that pattern's copied. Jackie, as kind of a follow-up, since we were talking about agencies, Biden's executive order last year actually directed a lot of agencies to do a lot of stuff on AI, start collecting information, opening up comment periods. Could you maybe give a quick overview on where that stands right now? What has been going on the agency side through the rulemaking process or comment making process so far?
Yeah, so I know for certain, I looked up this morning, there's a GAO report on agency compliance with some of the requirements from the EO. And it looks like the agencies themselves have all, or the main cabinet level agencies have all outline their safeguards that they need to have in place with regard to use of AI for their specific agencies, which is good because even on the legislative side of the legislative branch side of things, we're very close to releasing our House policy on AI. That comes from my committee. And we're very, very close to releasing that. And so I think that is a really good step for both the executive branch agencies and the legislative branch is how are we going to address AI? Because if we have a roadmap and a policy in place for ourselves, I think it makes it a lot easier to begin pushing out policy for the rest of everyone that isn't within the government. In regards to the promulgation of rules from the agencies, I'm not as tapped in on where each of them are. I think that they are definitely moving, and what I hope is that they are reaching out to industry and the stakeholders in the private sector to really make sure that they're getting their voices heard, and that any of the regulations that do come out from these agencies have a lot of input from the people that they're going to affect most. And so yeah, I think that there's movement on it, and I hope that they are just really looking towards industry to get some input there.
Yeah, and to your point about actually AI use within the public sector, that was actually the biggest trend that we saw last year at the state level. A lot of the first piece of legislation that passed were all about actually setting up focus groups and studying state use of AI. Now, however, there's been a lot more bills that have come out this past session that is actually looking at kind of the market commercial AI. There's maybe two in particular that have really made some headlines. The first was the Colorado SB 205 Consumer Protections Act, actually very similar to the AI Act in some ways. Now there's the controversial bill in California, SB 1047, around frontier models. Just this morning, I saw actually that Governor Newsom signed a slate of other AI-related bills in California, including some around deep fakes and getting permission from actors to use their likeness. But he actually sounds like he might be actually leaning towards vetoing 1047. I was wondering if either of you had any thoughts on some of the trends or things you're seeing at the state level and other thoughts there.
So, I mean, we obviously saw the sort of patchwork approach when it came to regulating crypto. That's what as we sort of dove into the AI regulatory environment in my job on the Hill, I've really reflected on what happened with crypto and the patchwork sort of regulation that happened there. And I think that everyone sort of wanted to avoid the same fate for AI, which is why we jumped in and we're trying to get ahead of the curve when ChatGPT dropped, and then we all sort of rushed to get ahead of the curve there. But I understand why states want to take the approach to regulate, because if we're not moving at the federal level, they feel inclined. And as a supporter of federalism, I can't shame states wanting to take matters into their own hands. It just becomes hard, especially from the compliance front, for industry to track everything that's happening in every different state. I do find it interesting. I was reading an article this morning about Governor Newsom and his worry about the chilling effects that that massive AI bill could have in California. I find that very interesting because I think that as we discuss it at a federal level, we'll probably come to a similar conclusion. And so trying to address the process of regulating while also inspiring and cultivating an environment of innovation, I think that's where everyone is just so stuck. And that's why you haven't seen a lot of movement at the federal level, is because we're trying to figure it out, and it's such a delicate dance. And even like we're seeing at the state, at the forefront, like California always tries to be at the forefront of these things. They're even struggling. So I think it goes to show how difficult it's going to be at the federal level.
Yeah, Hadassah, any comments?
No, I think that sums up the point of this balancing act really nicely. I think in addition to that, one of the core questions is, what are you actually regulating? Is it these consequential impacts, or is it at the input level, like at the start of this life cycle? Is that what you're going to be focusing on? Is it at the end of the life cycle, somewhere in between? I think that does make a difference for what the implications of these pieces of legislation are going to be. But fully agree with you, Jackie, on like this balancing act at different levels, state and federal, and then across innovation and regulation. It's really complicated.
Yeah, awesome. Really appreciate that overview. I think since we're now talking about that trade-off between innovation, the regulatory side, oftentimes for some of these things, protecting consumers versus the innovation and benefits we can get from AI, makes sense to start talking about now. How does this impact a lot of companies? We've got a lot of participants listening in today who are actively going to be involved either in building AI on the side of actually understanding some of these laws and regulations. So maybe, Jackie, I can start with you. What are some of the things you're hearing about from people lobbying about these issues, both on the AI side, maybe on the advocacy side? How are they worried about this is going to impact particularly businesses, both big and small?
Yeah, so I think any business owner, small business up to Fortune 500 CEO is thinking about AI. I don't know if it's all worry, but I think everyone is thinking, A, how can I utilize this to enhance our company's productivity? B, how is that enhanced productivity going to affect the workers of my company? C, do I need to implement some sort of policy, even though we're not using AI actively, but maybe some of my employees are? Do I need to implement this, but then people don't understand the use cases of AI all the time? So there's so many different things I think are going through people who are running businesses' heads at the moment. I think that it's going to be a very, very helpful tool once people get over the sort of fear of AI and robots taking over human jobs. I simply don't see that to be the case. And now I may be an optimist in this arena, but I think the thing that's going to be most important is upskilling. And that's one thing that I know Congress has thought a lot about. And I don't know if there's specific legislation yet, but the thought of upskilling current workers. So maybe your standard mid-level manager gets 25% of their duties cut out of their job description because it can be handled by AI. What's going to fill that other 25% of their time? Is it more higher level skills? Like what is going to fill that time? But I don't think it's going to eliminate jobs. It's just going to change what people do in their day-to-day jobs. And I think that is probably the number one concern and fear of both workers and business owners and the executive branch or executive level employees. So that's sort of what we've heard. And coming from the regulatory side of things, I don't think there needs to be fear about a massive loss of jobs. I just think that it's going to be very important for everyone to consider how workers can be upskilled.
Yeah, to your point about the upskilling, actually, one of the first requirements of the EU AI Act that's coming into effect is their literacy requirements, just focused both on making sure that the people building and overseeing AI have the skills to do so. Also making sure everyone who's going to be using AI can also understand some of the potential risks about it. So oftentimes simply misusing these systems for things they're not intended for can be some of the biggest harms. To that point, because there are a lot of these different regulations floating about, maybe Hadassah, could you address how both Responsible AI Institute is helping orgs stay on top of these things, as well as other resources you know about for helping orgs just stay on top of what's a very complex and fast-changing regulatory environment for this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in most organizations, and it's the majority of them that are thinking through the development, deployment, or use of AI, I think those relevant stakeholders within these organizations are to some extent, of course, already aware of what's going on, right? Like you keep track of some of these developments, but of course there are very helpful regulatory tracker tools. Just saying that as a point of departure, it's part of how we keep up with what is going on and delving deeper into the details. But to prevent this extremely time-consuming activity to be a part of your day-to-day work, what we also do at the Responsible AI Institute is offer organizations the tools and resources they need to understand what requirements are set and how do you make them practical. So not only the what, but also the how. Now, one of the ways that we do this is through our conformity assessments. these are extremely helpful tools for organizations, not just to indicate their compliance with whatever legislation is already in place. That's part of it, but I would definitely say that a really important component of these types of assessments is to better understand across different pieces of legislation or even a regulation that may still be in soft law format, what requirements, what do you need to take into consideration, and in line with that, what controls would you have to put in place across development, deployment, and use, to really ensure that you're prepared to align with a lot of the objectives of these key regulatory frameworks. So an example is, of course, the EU AI Act. You could think of soft law instruments such as the NIST AI risk management framework as well, standards by ISO as an example. So I would say that's part of what we do. And then in addition to that, we also support organizations in implementing some of these requirements, because it's really easy to stay at that high level. And there are a lot of these high level principles and concepts. But then the question really is, what do you do next, right? Like, how do I actually address these issues? It's nice to know I need to ensure fairness, but what does it mean? So at that level, we're really trying to dig deeper into those concepts and support organizations in implementation.
You mentioned both the ISO 42001 framework and the NIST AI risk management framework. Could you maybe expand upon those a little bit more for some of the listeners who may not be as familiar with them? What are these? How do they fit into some of those regulations that we were just talking about? Are those applicable towards everyone, only to the model builders? Maybe just kind of explain those a little bit further.
Yeah, definitely. So these standards are considered soft law instruments. So they're not binding, but you can commit to implementing the requirements that are set out or the controls that are set out in them. Standards typically focus on either the more organizational governance or the product level when we're talking about the AI space. So think of ISO 42001 as an example, as one of those organizational governance standards, putting in place those controls that organizations should consider, such as putting in place an AI policy, thinking about that AI literacy and training aspect, and other components at that governance level. And then product standards focus more on the components of a system, for instance. Now, there's a standard, ISO 42005, which is still in development, I believe. And that, for instance, focuses on an AI impact assessment, really considering the different impacts across individuals, groups of individuals, society, environment, that should be taken into consideration at that development stage. NIST is an example as well, really focusing somewhat differently on the same components, essentially, and offering organizations guidance, again, not on that what necessarily, but on the how. And I think that's also the purpose of a lot of these standards, really trying to provide more substance to some of the high level principles, so that it becomes easier to understand now, what do I actually do?
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, very helpful. Maybe Jackie, back to you. When we're thinking about some of these different frameworks, the different compliance requirements now in companies, plenty of companies oftentimes think about compliance as a little bit of a tax or just another check the box exercise. How are kind of you and others, or also maybe the people lobbying Congress, thinking about these different compliance requirements? What are some things that they're struggling with already, either on this front or on other regulations? And how is that affecting maybe how you're thinking about AI regulations?
Yeah, I think one major concern that I've heard is with the EU AI Act and a lot of those compliance requirements, I believe they're going to come to fruition in 2026. I think a lot of these major businesses that have an international presence are very concerned about the difference in compliance that might be necessary from what's out there in the EU, maybe what's going to come out of Asia, and then what could happen here. That could just be, they could have huge compliance costs because of all the differences. The one thing that's kind of tough about that is I feel like most industries or most topics have a lot of different international compliance requirements. So sometimes it's hard to have a lot of sympathy, because if you're in the global space, you sort of have to have different approaches for everything. We'll think about data privacy, how there's different requirements for data privacy in different countries. So I think that is a major concern that I've heard. And from my involvement with the discussion on legislating here in the US, I'm not sure, I truly am not sure how closely we are going to track to the EU AI Act. It could end up, maybe we follow exactly in their footsteps. But I think we're still at such an early stage that it's unclear how closely it's going to track. And if I'm thinking about it candidly and out in the open, I'm not even sure how much each individual committee on both the Senate and the House side is going to even look at the EU AI Act. So I think that is a major concern that I'm hearing the most. But I think that the next step that we need to take on the legislative front is just trying to figure out what the next step we're going to take on the legislative front is. And maybe worry less a little bit about how we're going to match with everything else that's happening around the globe.
Yeah, no, that's really insightful points. Thank you both of you for kind of covering that. Actually, I'll use that as a little bit of that transition towards what we're expecting to see next, really in the next year, also what's happening around the world, really trying to give people some foresight into what they might be thinking about next. Maybe that question about how do we keep innovation going, as well as how do we actually ensure that even government can keep up? Because I know that was one of the big questions and sticking points of the AI Act is whether things were being regulated too early. I think we're very likely to see, especially on the Senate side, as they're thinking about innovation as both a way to grow the economy as well as maintain kind of a national security standards against potentially unfriendly states, how that's impacting their thoughts on the innovation side. Maybe I'll start with you, Jackie, and thinking about what are actually some of the things that you think the legislative branch is going to do to incentivize that innovation, promote that. We've talked about regulating it, but the other side of the coin is what are you seeing and hearing to try and grow that sector?
So yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. And I think that there was a question in the chat too, maybe about national security and looking at how we expand and foster an innovative AI environment here, but then also look at not sharing all the innovations we do in AI because of national security concerns. And I think that the real expansion in AI started in the national security realm. It started there, like our military and our armed forces, I think, were on some of the forefront, and the Defense Department was really involved. And I think that that's where a lot of this is going to stem from, both in legislating, and things are going to come out of NDAA, and like it starts at the defense level and then works its way down. I do still think there's probably discussions and decisions that need to be made on how much we want to make publicly available, because even though it can help private industry and other sectors, it also then falls into the hands of our adversaries, and we have to balance that cost benefit analysis. But I think most of the government approach to this is starting in the defense national security realm and is going to work its way down. So I think we'll see a lot in this year's NDAA, even after it comes out of conference. I think we're going to see investments into AI and just different approaches. I know that there's been some approaches that have talked about like having certifications at colleges for a national AI innovation program and things like that. So I think that there's a lot of thought process coming from DC and the Capitol, and it's starting with national security, and it will work its way down to other industries. Personal view there.
Awesome. For those of you from outside the Beltway, the NDAA is the National Defense Authorization Act, basically the big defense budget for the U.S. government that's passed every year. Definitely a lot of AI stuff that'll be inside of that. Hadassah, to throw it back over to you, because we were just talking about some of the other international things going on, give us maybe a quick overview of what's going on outside the U.S., how some of those ideas or treaties or impacts could actually come back into the US, and give us a sense just for what's going on there.
Yeah, I think the dynamic is really interesting, and we're kind of seeing like this domino effect within the US and then what's happening outside, all these interlinkages across jurisdictions that potentially could determine, but in line with what Jack is just saying, it's not quite clear what the US eventually may want to do. But we're essentially seeing, I'm just going to give that whole picture, right? That moving back to what we were discussing earlier at the state level, there's a lot of potential for states in the United States to set an example on what type of legislation may come out, right? It's kind of like this leading by example type of approach, whereby state one may decide to set out a specific piece of legislation and may form an example for others to follow. At the same time, when we look at the federal level, there may be an incentive to harmonize to some extent, this patchwork of legislation that is coming out. And the question is it possible to take certain actions at that federal level? Or is this scope too large? And then there is this element of international competition where there are frameworks coming from outside that, whether or not the United States is involved in it, will have an impact on organizations, businesses operating within the United States. And at the same time, we're seeing like the convention framework by the Council of Europe, where the United States is taking an active part in the development of that and in its implementation. So I think there are a lot of loose pieces right now that are kind of juggling and moving alongside each other. So I think at this point in time, what is important to get back to the discussion on, where is the US heading with this? How are all these different things going to impact the direction in which air regulation will be heading? Maybe we can't know, or maybe organizations can't know what will be next. But if we look at some of the activities that the US is undertaking by partaking in these international efforts and agreeing to, certain principles, core principles that they are aligned with, I think it will be really important to take inspiration from what is happening outside of the US. And understanding maybe not how to comply to the extent that that may not be relevant to you, but at least to put in place the relevant controls, or at least to benchmark against those requirements to see what do we have in place, because chances are high, if the US is part of this convention and agrees with these principles, some sort of an implementation is going to be given to those core principles. It may look different in a practical sense, but the objective, again, is the same. So I would to say, and I'm sure this has been said many times, start early, benchmark against these requirements, and then hopefully by the time that things will become more clear, you're ready to be prepared, more than if you would just wait to see what happens.
Maybe to give a specific example of some of those other things you were talking about, China actually has been very active in regulating AI, and specifically has some stuff now for generative AI, including actually a set of tests that AI models need to go through, clear liability laws that do put a lot of responsibility on the model creators for anything that those models are generating, as well as now recommended, or actually I believe they're mandatory security controls that do need to be set up on top of these kinds of things. Now, understandably, the Chinese regulations do require their LLM systems to represent certain views about the world, right? What they are viewing as misinformation could be construed actually as just the truth in different places. And this creates potentially some conflicting ethical guidelines around some of this. Jackie, I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts here. Do you expect similar regulations in the US? Should we be regulating what these models can or can't say in the way that China is?
So I'm always going to be anti-China, so I might be pretty biased in this answer. No, I don't think that we should have state-controlled any sort of censorship there. Now, do I think models shouldn't be biased? Of course, nobody wants a overtly biased model. But when we reflect on this, and I think a lot of people who have worked in this space have, humans are inherently biased. And so it's a unique dichotomy here where humans are inherently biased. We are the ones who are building these models and inputting the data, and all the data typically comes from human experience or human interaction. And so do you really want to strip the human aspects out of that data that you're putting into a machine? That's where there's a real difficulty there. I don't think that there should be any sort of government decision on what is misinformation or something that's inputted into this model, or because I just think that becomes very big brothery, especially as AI models are being more and more integrated into our life. Like if you Google something, there's an AI answer that pops up. And so if people start to be fearful that the government is controlling the answers that AI can give people, then the distrust in the technology is going to abound. And so I think that it's a really delicate dance of wanting to make sure things are made morally correct, but not over regulating everything and becoming like a China. We do not want to be China. So that's sort of my view on the topic.
Yeah, perhaps it's impossible to have unbiased AI, mainly because everyone is biased in their own definition of what the AI bias is, which can get pretty meta. Although there have been a couple of laws that have tried to set, some clearer criteria for this. In particular, I'm thinking about some of Colorado's work around life insurance, setting very clear kinds of metrics and thresholds of things, and also New York City's law around AI use in hiring and the specific bias audit happening there. These are both good examples of kind of use case and even sector specific AI regulations that have happened at different levels. And as we're talking about future trends here, Adalha, I'm curious to get your thoughts. Do you expect more of these kind of use case specific things and these kinds of almost more nuanced and technical regulations? Or do you think that things are moving in a different direction right now?
Yeah, I think coming from my position, it's hard to, and I guess anyone, hard to predict what may be happening or speculate around whether this will become more prominent. I would certainly hope that it will. Just looking at some of the requirements or some of the expectations around handling AI systems in particular, you look at, for instance, building out an AI inventory. You really start with an AI system, great. But then what you're really trying to inventory is in which use case, what the use cases are, what context are you actually using these systems? And based on that, you can then determine like the risk levels that are associated with it and relevant controls that you would want to put in place. So that is an example for, and there are many others for the reason why I think that building out more use case specific pieces of regulation, even if it's just at the guidance level, I think will be extremely helpful. So I would hope definitely, and we're seeing this across our own member organizations at Ray Institute as well. A lot of questions around, great, we have like this broad framework. Now, how does it apply to us? Like I'm an organization working in energy, I work in finance, I work in healthcare. And even that can be, broken down into little and even smaller pieces. So there will definitely be a need for more guidance at this use case level, for sure.
Awesome. Also, to kind of close up on that point, there's been some interesting work on specific use cases at the local level of government. I think the city of San Jose is actually leading up a coalition called the GovAI Coalition, and they've done a couple of now developed some good templates, good resources out there for anybody who's looking for some good guidance on how you could do actually an impact assessment, recommendations on public sector use of AI, some good stuff there. So if we're also talking about other trends, we like to talk a lot about the international level, these cross group things of treaties, AI acts, but some of the day-to-day things that people might interact with might be, helping use AI to fill out a parking ticket appeal, filling out some of their tax stuff, things like this. I'll remind everyone, we're going to move on to some questions in a minute here. So go ahead and post any questions or things in the Q&A feature. I'll also try and check the chat. But as a kind of closing note for both of you, as people are adding in some questions, what are some things that you think aren't actually yet being really addressed in the conversation around the regulations? Are there gaps that you're seeing or thinking about, things that you've heard about or would like to see more discussion around? Jackie, I'll start with you.
I think what's really important to remember as we discuss regulations, so like the Biden administration put out their EO, and it is good to have some guiding documents coming from the federal government. But when it comes to creating laws for this country, the legislative branch, Article 1, like we are the ones who are tasked with actually coming up with laws. And so I'm going to be very curious to see what happens as the agencies start to push out the rules that they've promulgated, if there'll be a lot of courtroom challenges to some of the underlying authority that the agencies actually have to promulgate rules in this field. I think people often forget about that. They see the Biden EO and are like, okay, now we have some rules on AI, but you have to look back and think about what authorities that the legislative branch has actually given to these agencies. And I'm not sure that the legislative branch has given every single one of these agencies that's been directed to promulgate rules on AI the authority to promulgate rules on AI. Now, in the interim, it's nice to have this guiding document, but we need to really think about the importance of what's going to come out of the legislative branch and how that will affect the industry writ large. But beyond simply legislating, I think it's really important to look at how the legislative branch entity, so CAO, the Copyright Office is part of the legislative branch of the Library of Congress. All of these different entities are also coming up with AI plans and AI implementation guidance and different guidance from these different legislative branch entities. And I think it's important that private industry and stakeholders look at that as well. And even our policy that's going to come out, I think that's really important that the enterprise system and stakeholders writ large look at how government itself is addressing AI for inspiration on how maybe they can address AI in their businesses or whatnot. And so I just think that all of that is important to remember as we have this broader regulatory discussion on artificial intelligence.
So, and Hadassah, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think my thoughts would relate mainly to that implementation side of things, right? When certain criteria and requirements are set, in my experience, that there still is a really big gap between understanding again the what and the how. So in my ideal world, I would love to see beyond, at this legislative side of things, getting through public consultations information from those who are actually supposed to implement this at the end of the day and other stakeholders, what potential barriers could be, what issues could be, at this early stage. In addition to that, I would really love to see at that implementation stage, even when we're already talking about compliance, but before that, even at soft law instrument level. How are organizations actually coping with these frameworks? How are they implementing? And hopefully use more, I would say, science-based or data-driven mechanisms and structures to inform policies as we move forward, as opposed to only including this at the start when I think the real issue is at that implementation level. So I'd love to see this more top-down, bottom-up approach, new methods, new ways of thinking about making policy that can at least ensure that, what's happening up there eventually comes down and connects to what's happening on the ground. Not very practical, but that's in my ideal situation what I would love to see more of.
Yeah, along similar lines, we hear from a lot of organizations that they're looking to fine tune or adapt some of these more flexible large language models for their own purposes, but then they don't necessarily have the ability to comply with some of these heavier regulations that might come down for them. So they're trying to understand at what point do they start switching from kind of just being a user, even if they're modifying it to some extent, to actually being responsible maybe for some of these heavier general purpose AI things or frontier model requirements that are coming out? And really, how do we even handle the liability of something if you are fine tuning or adapting some of these models? You can go on and add a couple of additional examples to something like Llama 3, and it feels kind of still unfair to someone be fully liable for everything around that for such a small modification. But then there's, I think, good discussions there, similarly around some of that open source stuff. So we've had a couple of good questions come in. I'm going to try and jump around to some of the ones I think we haven't really covered throughout this. First one actually was comparing a little bit what was going on to AI with some stuff that has happened with cyber and some other stuff before. And actually my question for both of you is, how is AI different? We've done technology regulations before. There's been some good analogies between cybersecurity stuff with different risks as people move to cloud-based systems. Kind of curious your thoughts. What is different about AI, especially as we might want to regulate it?
I can start off. I think that maybe 50% of people would disagree with me here, but I don't think it's that different. And I think we try to make each one of these new tech issues that come out. So like I referenced crypto earlier, or we talked about cyber, the next thing is going to be quantum. We try to make them all different, but if you look back, the path, at least legislatively, how we've approached it, it all ends up being the same. And so I think that it is more of the same when it comes to tech and how we are approaching it from the legislative side. Now, I think that AI can perhaps give us even more opportunities than some of the other tech issues or topics that have popped up in the past. And we may have to work even harder and continually develop our legislative approach to AI. But in my opinion, it seems like all of these new emerging tech that we try to approach from the legislative front all end up taking the same path.
Any thoughts from you, Hadassah?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in as well. I would agree. I don't think that looking at it from the implementation side, again, I think that there are a lot of similarities across different focal areas of regulation when it comes to technology, be it from cyber to AI, and as you said, to quantum. I know that's a bigger topic that is capturing the attention. What we see a lot of of our members, for instance, asking is when we're talking about implementation is like, oh, we already do a lot of these practices around data, for instance. How is this specific to AI? Like, can you give us more best practices around how this applies to AI? From our perspective, it's like we probably have a lot of things in place already, a lot of controls and mechanisms in place that also apply in, this AI space. So you may not even have to change all that much. Just add on to those items that are relevant in the AI domain. And I think one that's particularly relevant is that chain of involved parties. When you look at liability as an example, I think that's where it's going to become more complicated potentially, because it's just adding on more and more and more complications and additional parties and additional elements that you can't quite keep a grip of. So I think that's maybe just one area that I would like to highlight and say, like, maybe that's part of where it's different, but totally agree with you,
Yeah.
Jackie.
And one quick follow-up on that too. One lesson that I learned from my former boss is if it was illegal before AI, if the end action was illegal before AI, it is still illegal even though AI is involved. And I think that sometimes people are like, oh, we need to like change all the regulations and make it AI specific. Well, no, like if you look at election and misinformation or disinformation, if it was wrong or illegal before, just because they introduced AI into that conversation doesn't change the illegality of it. And I think that that is something that people need to revert back to is we have all of these laws on the book, specifically like talking about cyber, that could very easily apply to AI. You just have to make that connection. And so I think that that's important for people to remember too, is that we're not in this lawless anarchic state. There are lots of laws on the books that make a lot of actions illegal, and AI doesn't change that.
Yeah, I know one of the challenges I'm starting to see on this front, to the point, Hadassah, you made about kind of the supply chain, different actors along that, is that in the digital world, there are some things that do transcend kind of traditional borders of stuff. I think in my recent newsletter article, I mentioned that you could have an Indian employee of a US-based company scrape the data of somebody who lives in the EU, store that on a server somewhere else, train a model on it somewhere, then sell that model or even open source that model anywhere else in the world. Now suddenly you're dealing with at least maybe 5 or 6 different jurisdictions, different legal requirements around some of that stuff. That's going to make it complicated. There's a good question that came through earlier around deep fakes. This is a big topic. A couple of those California bills I mentioned were out there about that. Curious to get your thoughts or hear anything that you're thinking about or seeing around deep fake specifically. There's obviously stuff around elections. There's also been some unfortunate things in the news around kind of pornographic deep fake use, people actually generating stuff based on this and some of the risks around there. Curious to get your thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, so deepfakes I feel like are probably where the legislature has made the most progress. I know that there's been, especially in some of the like the pornographic realm, like there's been actual legislation that I think might have passed the Senate Judiciary Committee. And so I think that that's really good that we're able to move fast and sort of combat those super alarming use cases of deep fakes and AI to create deep fakes. I think when it comes to the election side of things, it's a difficult topic because we're so close to the election. And so obviously everyone wants to address it and nobody wants there to be dis or misinformation in campaigns or the election realm. But when we've taken so long to address the problem and now we're 50 days out from the election, it would be impossible to put something out and make sure there is compliance with everyone in this short time frame. I think that we need to learn our lesson on this, which we never do because like we can reflect back on crypto. We never learn a lesson on how fast we need to move, but we really should have probably moved faster to address election specific issues earlier, even last year around this point. And so that's my spiel on that.
Yeah, any thoughts from you, Hadassah?
No, I mean, I think, the question is whether how far can you go in managing these issues? And in an ideal world, we'd be able to say that with the right measures taken, you'd be able to, reduce the risks and impacts as much as possible. But with every new addition or every new advancement in this field of AI, like there are going to be those that are going to use it to enhance whatever business operations they're talking about, and there are those that are going to be misusing it for whatever reason. when you look at how you want to regulate, you could look at the different, again, across that chain of actors, who are you going to look at to regulate first? But again, I think because the complexity in understanding who you need to address and where that issue is, like the pain point lies, plus again, that discussion around innovation versus regulation, right? What are the impacts going to be once you regulate? Be it, different actors at different levels. You may cause more harm than you're actually addressing. So that's just my like very vague thought on this. But yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting couple of months coming up, and probably again, we haven't learned from the past, and we probably will not learn moving forward. So maybe we will. Maybe at some point, like we'll be able to cut through that knot. But yeah.
Maybe the one thing I can confidently say is that it's going to be a busy time in the AI regulatory side for sure. I apologize to everyone who asked questions that we weren't able to address. To be respectful of everyone's time, we are going to have to wrap it up today. But definitely check out some of the resources that the Responsible AI Institute has around some of these policy things, education. I'm also happy to connect with anybody on LinkedIn, share a little bit about what my company is working on this front as well. But thank you everyone so much for coming. Thank you both, Jackie and Dasa, for joining us today.